In my first mobile version of Terraria video, I said at the end if it got 1,000 likes I would create another video. I didn't think it was going to, however it surprisingly did, and now it's almost at 2,000. So here that is. In this video I will be pushing the mobile version of Terraria to its limits. I will correct some things I said in the previous episode, look into what actually exists in the game, decompile the game's files, and decompile some of the code to see what we can find. However, like the previous episode, if you don't care about any of that, you can skip to this part for the actual gameplay. However, I am warning you there isn't as much as the previous episode, as I am looking into what is still left to do, as I already beat the game in the previous episode. But first, I need to correct some things I said in the last episode. First of all, I said that the Archdemon was the first exclusive enemy, but this is incorrect. It was actually the Dragon Hornet, which I first encountered in the jungle. And speaking of the Archdemon and the crystal shards it drops on the 3DS version, I said that they were basically useless because there were no hard mode anvils. However, what I didn't mention is that they could have been used to craft the face sabers, because they were crafted at pre-hard mode anvils, which means you could get swords stronger than the Knight's Edge in pre-hard mode. The Dragon Snatcher is also not a hard mode enemy. I knew that this enemy was harder than a man-eater, and because I only found it after killing the wall of flesh, I figured that it was a hard mode enemy. Also at the end of the video I mentioned that this version was probably version 1.1. However, because snow exists in the game's files, it was probably version 1.1.1. However, let's now move on to things that should be in the game but aren't. First of all, there are 12 exclusive enemies. We have already encountered 3 of them, however there are some that we will never encounter. According to the files, NPC IDs 151 and 159 through 164 do not exist. Those happen to be the Shadowhammer, which we will talk about later, and the Archwyvern. But there were also some vanilla enemies that were also removed. IDs 86 through 92, 125 through 127, and 144 were removed. These happen to be the Unicorn, Wyvern, Twins, Skeletron Prime, Just the Head, and Mr. Stabby. Other than Mr. Stabby, it seems that these were removed because they were hard mode content. Mr. Stabby is also hard mode content, but both other snowmans are still there, so I'm not sure why they removed it. But I'm not sure why they didn't remove these exclusive enemies that are only available in hard mode, or these other vanilla enemies that are also only accessible in hard mode. The hollowed enemies may have been ignored because the hollow doesn't exist, but that doesn't explain why the Unicorn was removed. Either way, it should be noted that Skeletron Prime and the Twins were removed. However, the Destroyer was not, which means it might be possible to spawn it, but we'll get to that later. But I'm sure a lot of people are interested in Ocram. For those who don't know, this was the final boss on most versions except for Computer. Although despite it being the final boss, it does still have a pretty similar AI to the Eye of Cthulhu. But anyways, the textures do not exist. But there are references in the code. Not only that, but there are references to items that require killing Ocram to get. For example, the original endgame armor. This also has their original textures. But before we get into that, it should be noted that Plantera and Golem do not exist. There are also no references to them, which means this is the version right before version 1.2. And also there are no references to Turco or Lepus. But now let's move on to how much content is actually in the game. In the last episode we concluded that pre-hard mode exists and also some hard mode content. But if we want to find what items actually exist, we have to look through the textures. And it doesn't look like there are any missing items like there are with the NPCs. Items 0 through 162 exist, plus 23 additional exclusive items, which for those unaware are the endgame items and some items related to Ocram. However, to figure out which are obtainable, we have to look at the recipes. But you may be wondering, how am I going to do this? Nowadays you could just look at the wiki, but this will tell you inaccurate information as we're looking into an old version. We could go down to the history part, but it doesn't show everything that we want, and it doesn't show us recipes for items that aren't supposed to exist, although I don't think there are anyways. But how are we going to extract all the recipes from the game? First we would need to extract all the files, which I did in the last episode, but there's no file that directly tells us the recipes. We can use modern Terraria to find clues on where this recipe list would be. And for those who are unaware, while decompiling Terraria there was a function with all of the hard-coded recipes, which would lead us to assume that the recipes we are looking for is within the game's code. But there's one slight problem. The computer version of Terraria was made in C#. This just happens to be a language that is very easy to decompile. APKs are typically made in Java, meaning we would have to decompile Java code. But it's not that simple. The mobile versions of Terraria were created with native code, which means they were not created with Java, but with C or C++, which means that when Terraria was compiled, it was compiled into machine code, meaning if we want to actually look through the code, this is what we have to work with. I can throw the .so file into Ghidra and see roughly what it is doing. Ghidra also shows function names and displays the code as pseudocode, which is more readable than assembly. But as you can see, this code still makes no sense. However, spending a little while and comparing it to the modern day C# code, I was able to figure out what all the values are. I then created a program to run through this giant file of almost 3,000 lines of code and output it into a more readable format. I then created a web page to display all of the recipes. The page was crudely made and I will not be releasing it, however you can still see that all the recipes are shown here. And this allowed me to discover some pretty interesting things, like how mech boss spawners required copper bars, and how hollowed bars don't even exist, which means the hollowed armor would require all 3 hard mode ore variants. And same goes for the tools, such as the Drax. It also should be noted that none of the exclusive content is craftable, so unfortunately there is no way of obtaining any of this content. But anyways, most of the items that require unicorn horns or souls to craft are unobtainable, and all of the items that require a hard mode anvil to craft should be unobtainable. I say should be because, like in the last episode, I mentioned that it might be possible to get the hard mode ores, which I'm interested to test out. But first there were a couple things I wanted to do, like get the Drax or get the Knight's Edge. But before any of that, I managed to get Terraria running on a newer device. In the last episode, I was using my mom's old tablet, and the gameplay quality was not very ideal. But using ADB, Android Debug Bridge, I was able to forcibly install the APK onto my newer phone, ignoring the incompatible version error message. And luckily it seems to work fine on my Fold 4. Now it should be noted that this won't run on some of the new phones, as newer phones are losing capability for 32-bit applications, meaning for specifically Samsung phones, if you have a phone newer than an S23, you will not be able to run this no matter what you do. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but a lot of old games only run in 32-bit mode, which makes game preservation harder because you can't even run the games. But along with getting Terraria running on new devices that support 32-bit applications, I was also able to extract the player worlds and files from Terraria, meaning I was also able to move the player and world files to a new device. But anyways, that's enough yapping. Here is the actual gameplay. So after logging into the world, this time on a device with a larger screen, I decided the first thing I was going to do was try to get the Drax. For those who don't know, the Drax, or Ham Drax as it was originally called, was obtainable through shadow chests, which means that the best tool in the game could have been obtained after killing Skeletron. But I didn't have a shadow key, so I had to go get one. So I went to the dungeon and opened all of the remaining golden chests. Unfortunately, I did not get a shadow key, so I had to go into another world, kill Skeletron, and then search those chests. However, after spending more than 30 minutes farming for keys and opening chests, I also didn't get a shadow key in this world, so I had to create a new world, which interestingly had a snow biome in it. Like I mentioned in a previous video, not all worlds were guaranteed to have a snow biome, so I took the time to get some snow in case I wanted it in my actual world. But after that, I proceeded to kill Skeletron and then search the dungeon. And after opening a couple chests, I was wondering if shadow keys were actually removed. The 2 previous worlds didn't contain a shadow key, however they did contain chests with just normal gold keys, which made me wonder if shadow keys were just replaced with golden keys. So after opening a couple more chests, I did finally get a shadow key. It only took an hour in 3 different worlds. However, OBS did freeze, so unfortunately I don't have the video. I ended up updating OBS because I didn't want this happening again. And now with the shadow key, I was able to open shadow chests, which would hopefully give me the Drax. So I went back to my main world, opened the first shadow chest, but unsurprisingly didn't get the Drax. However, I did get a Phoenix Blaster, which is interesting because on the wiki it doesn't mention that this was obtainable from a shadow chest. I then proceeded to check all of the rest of the shadow chests, but unfortunately none of them contained the Drax. I did however find a half-broken heart crystal, which was interesting, and I'm not sure why this happened, but anyways I ended up searching all 3 worlds that I had, none of them containing the Drax. I then proceeded to check a 4th and 5th world with no luck, and on the 6th world I came across this interesting item. This is a mobile exclusive item, and while going through the item textures I couldn't find this one. It turns out the shiny black slab is item ID 603, which means it's supposed to have this item texture but doesn't. I've never actually seen this item texture before, but despite that I knew that this item would spawn an android pet, which would explain why the texture is the color that it is. But it doesn't explain why it was switched out for the shiny black slab texture. But anyways, in the same world I discovered a mimic. It turns out in the previous episode when I said statues don't spawn enemies, this was incorrect, as this chest statue happened to spawn 3 mimics. Unfortunately they did not drop any cool items, but just to make sure I brought it to my main world and tested if they dropped anything there. Unfortunately, they also did not. Originally, I was digging straight down at spawn to get to the underworld. However, I realized it would be faster to go through the dungeon. So while waiting for night, I ended up going to the ocean, which is where I found an exclusive enemy, which was the orca. Although it may not be so exclusive anymore as they are bringing it back in 1.4.5. Anyways, I checked 12 worlds for the Drax. Unfortunately, none of them had it. According to this Terraria archive fandom wiki, the Drax had a 0.003% chance of spawning in a shadow chest. That is a 1 in 333 chance. With there being only 3 to 4 chests per world, this could take over 80 worlds. so I had to give up searching for the Drax. And because I also didn't want to farm for the Night's Edge, I decided to do something else. I noticed that the player never destroys blocks when spawning in. It seems to always spawn on the highest most block at the world spawn. So I decided to see how far I could take this, and by doing so I discovered that you could build outside of the map. But when spawning back in, I just spawn inside of the world borders and inside of the blocks. So there's nothing interesting here. But what is interesting is this glitch that I found on YouTube. This user was playing this exact version of Terraria and happened to have a chest break in half. For those who don't know, if this is done on a chest with items inside of it and you try updating the chest item will drop but nothing will change. Meaning you could have an infinite chest generator, which actually could be done pretty easily using actuated blocks. As you can see here, just by flipping this lever I can get a bunch of chests. I can then sell these chests for a bunch of gold. But I also wanted to see if there were even hard mode enemies. So far none had spawned, so I decided to create an underground corruption. So I bombed the corruption to get some ebonstone. And if hard mode enemies don't spawn, it might be possible to get souls of night. And if somehow I can get a mithril anvil, I could then get to the destroyer spawner. And spawn the destroyer, which is the one boss with the textures that were not removed. The mithril anvil though might be hard to get, as I do not have a hammer strong enough to destroy any of the altars. And the shadow hammer which could have dropped the mithril bars was removed. In theory I could have got the Drax, which is a strong enough hammer, but we'll talk about that later. But for now I was creating an underground corruption, and while doing so Tim spawned, which didn't do much but give me a wizard hat, which isn't overly interesting. But anyways, while confirming the underground corruption did exist by the music, there were no hard mode enemies, nor did anything drop any souls of night, which made me wonder if the world was actually in hard mode. There were many signs to show that the world may not have even been in hard mode despite killing the wall of flesh, and it would have been easier for the devs to remove the ability to get into hard mode instead of removing all hard mode content, which I'm wondering if they realized later, as some hard mode content was removed. But anyways, to be certain if the world is in hard mode I had to check the code. It was a little hard to comb through, but I did eventually find what I was looking for, and it turns out after killing the wall of flesh the hard mode variable is never set, meaning assuming the wall of flesh was the only way to get into hard mode is inaccessible, meaning the previous plans to destroy an altar or spawn the destroyer is unachievable. And to make sure this was the case, I went to go destroy the broken altar that we found in the previous episode. But unfortunately OBS was not recording. But either way, almost nothing happened. I swung my sword, it updated a tile, and the altar got destroyed. It simply despawned because it was unstable with no message saying that ores respawned. Kind of anticlimactic for something that could have completely broken the game. I then tried destroying another altar with a hammer just to see what would happen, but it did as you'd expect. I just got hurt and nothing happened. I also tried with the Drax just to make sure it wasn't in hard mode and it didn't get destroyed. So with nothing else to do, I headed back to my base, but while doing so I found another exclusive enemy, that being the albino antlion. But much like all the other exclusive enemies, I'm not sure why they added it, as the original enemy already existed. But you may be wondering, I skimmed over the fact that I got the Drax, as I got bored while searching for it and it was a very rare drop. Well, for those who saw my community post that I made a month ago at this point, I was able to extract the player and world files without rooting my device. Apparently all I had to do was create a backup of the game and extract those files. With these files I then tested them on the computer version, which unfortunately I had no luck with. But with these files I could modify them, recreate the backup, and then have whatever items I wanted. Which is what I did. Just for testing I got myself the Drax just to see what it would do. And like you saw before, it did nothing. So despite it being technically possible to obtain, it wouldn't have helped. But I can also modify the world file. In theory, I can find the byte that stores the value for hard mode and then set that to true. It would allow me to hack into hard mode and see what was available. So that's what I did. I went through the code to find where the variable was saved in the file and located the exact byte. As you can see by the screenshot, this is where it's located. There were obviously other values I could have changed, but for now all I needed to do was set the world to hard mode. So that's what I did, and then after restoring the backup, I launched Terraria. For some reason when doing this it resets the permissions and anything saying that you've previously launched the game, but as long as the files are there it doesn't matter. So I tried launching the world and I was half expecting it to crash, but luckily it didn't. Not only that, but it never actually crashed at all. Anyways, after getting into the world, the first thing I did was go to the Dryad. If the Dryad sold hollowed seeds, it would confirm that the world is in hard mode, and she does. These hollowed seeds would also allow me to get the hollow, which because hard mode was not set properly, the hollow and corruption did not spawn after killing the wall of flesh. However, speaking of the corruption, I figured I would go down to my underground corruption to get some souls of night, as these souls of night would allow me to create the destroyer spawner, the only boss that is currently implemented. So while waiting for some enemies to spawn, the wizard spawned, and then right after there was a hard mode enemy, and not long after that I got the first soul of night. And for those who are unaware, this is what they used to look like. They all shared the same texture but had different colors, and luckily those colors are the same as in modern Terraria. But while killing some hard mode enemies, I was realizing that my weapons are kind of inadequate, and if I wanted stronger weapons I would need to get some hard mode ore, which just brings me back to the original problem. I don't have a hammer strong enough enough to destroy an altar. In theory, I could have gotten some hard mode bars from the removed shadow hammer, but because it was removed, that's not an option. And the only way I could think of doing this was cheat in the pound hammer. So that's what I did, and then decided to go down to the corruption to destroy an altar. And after the first one, I got cobalt. I then realized while going to the second altar that the cobalt deposits were massive. However, after destroying the second and third altar, I got mithril and adamantite. The other 3 ores were not implemented at this point, so cobalt, mithril, and adamantite were the only options. I then spent the next 45 minutes mining for a bunch of ores, to then eventually craft full adamantite armor. I also created an adamantite sword. However, all of the swords except for the Muramasa had a very long wait time. This was updated in the very next version. However, in this version they were almost unusable, as they did not swing fast enough to do enough damage. So the best weapon I had at the moment was the Phoenix Blaster, which I will realize later is one of the strongest weapons I could get. Either way, I then went back to farming for Souls of Night, and after getting enough I went back to the surface. I then also took some time to create an artificial hollow, as eventually I would need it, but after that I then created the mechanical worm. And after waiting for it to turn night, I eventually spawned it, and right off the bat I noticed that it wasn't red, it was some shade of cyan. But anyways, I ended up dying pretty quickly. This was the best armor I could get, along with the best weapon. In hindsight, it turns out it was also the best arrows, but along with all that, I was at the max health. The max health being half of what it would be on computer, and to be fair, this boss was not made to be possible. I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure the old mobile versions made all the NPCs have less health, and give the player access to tools they shouldn't have in that stage of progression. Most notably the Drax, which was obtainable right after Skeletron, despite being crafted after all of the mechanical bosses were defeated. The health theory could be backed up by all of the pre-hardmode bosses, excluding the Wall of Flesh, being absurdly easy and not requiring very much preparation. And with the Wall of Flesh being the intended last boss, it could have kept all the health that it would have on PC. And if this is the case, it means that the mechanical bosses could have had the same health as on PC, making it harder in comparison to the other bosses on the mobile versions. Either way, I had to change something if I wanted to kill the destroyer. So I started making an actual arena, and while making the arena I had the idea to get wings. Like mentioned before, the wyvern textures were removed, likely indicating that they removed the enemy entirely. Ocram's textures were also removed, however there still exist references to the boss. So it might be the case that they never actually removed any of these enemies, but only removed the textures because they shouldn't have been able to spawn in the first place. But because now they are able to spawn, it's possible that maybe they just spawn but are invisible. So I went up to space and waited a little while for a wyvern to spawn. But after waiting about 10 minutes, I didn't have one spawn. So maybe that theory is incorrect, but more notably, it means that I'm not able to get wings. In this version, there only exists 2 different types of wings, both requiring Souls of Flight. I could cheat the item in, but I wanted to see how far I could get without cheating any other items. So with this discovery, I went back to creating the arena. I then went down to the underground corruption to farm for cursed flames. These would allow me to create the best hard mode arrows and bullets. I also came across an actual mimic. This one didn't spawn from a statue and would actually give me an item. I then remembered that the corruption on the surface spreads, so I went to the surface and realized that it had almost taken over my entire desert. And while making a break in the sand, there was another exclusive enemy, that being the Dark Mummy. It's hard to tell, and I don't think I would have noticed without the names, but it turns out a bunch of dark and shadow mummies had spawned. It's interesting, but I carried on. I went back down to the underground corruption to farm there, which is actually where I saw another exclusive enemy, or should I say encountered, because I never actually saw it. As you can see here, I randomly get hit out of nowhere, losing about a quarter of my health, and eventually, because of it, almost died. It turns out this was the previously mentioned Shadow Hammer, one of the exclusive enemies that I thought had been removed. Despite its textures missing, it still spawned, proving my previous theory correct. This not only meant the wyvern, but also the other 2 mechanical bosses could actually spawn despite their textures not existing. This means I would be able to get wings, kill bosses that originally I thought weren't gonna spawn, and also potentially spawn Ocram, but we will get into that later. For now I wanted wings, which meant I had to go back up to space to get some Souls of Flight, and after not too long I had an Arch Wyvern spawn. This was an exclusive enemy, which was a copy of the wyvern, but it was way harder. Not only that, but I had to fight it while it was invisible, but unfortunately while fighting it, it despawned. Because I was running this version of Terraria on a device that wasn't supposed to run it, the game was not designed to run in this aspect ratio, meaning, and you may have seen it previously, that there are some glitches. One of those being that enemies could spawn on screen, which means that enemies could also despawn just outside the screen space. So if I wanted to kill these invisible enemies, I would have to make sure they're on screen. This is obviously easier said than done, especially with wyverns. I eventually had another wyvern spawn, and this one also despawned, but 3rd time's a charm, so on the 3rd wyvern spawn, this being an arch wyvern, I was able to kill it. And after all that, all I got was 5 Souls of Flight. Both wings required 25, so I would be at this for a little while. Eventually I had a normal wyvern spawn, which I then killed, which dropped 9. This was better, but I would still have to kill a bunch more. I then went back down to my base and had this weird door glitch happen. It was slightly different than the one in the video that I showed previously, but it was a similar concept where the door was seemingly bugged. However, this isn't totally new, as doors being invisible is something that can be done in modern Terraria. I will go more in depth on this slightly later, but eventually I got all of the souls of flight that I needed. I just now needed 30 souls of night or light, so after about an hour of grinding I had the required souls and eventually crafted wings. I also then decided to reforge them, which you may realize is not overly intuitive, as there's technically nowhere specifying that this item slot right here is for reforging items. Either way, I think I ended up spending 2 platinum coins. At this point I was ready to kill the destroyer again, so after waiting for night I eventually spawned it. In the beginning of the fight my damage output was quite weak. I was using the Phoenix Blaster with cursed bullets. The cursed bullets were the best bullets I could get, and the Phoenix Blaster, despite being available in pre-hard mode, may have also been the best. I was using the melee adamantite helmet to get more defense, but I eventually moved over to the ranged one to do more damage as it was running out of time. As you can see, the night was almost half over, but the destroyer's health was nowhere near that. Eventually, out of desperation, I moved over to the adamantite repeater with explosive arrows. Despite the arrows being accessible in pre-hard mode, I was able to do way more damage than with the bullets. These arrows also damaged the player, meaning I would have to make sure I wasn't too close to where they exploded. It was also a full moon, meaning I would have to watch out for werewolves. There were also some moments where I had wyverns spawn. Not only was I worrying about the destroyer, but I also now had to kill invisible enemies. But eventually, after all that, I managed to kill the destroyer with a few seconds left before it would turn day. And to prove this, right as it turned day, a goblin army spawned. I eventually collected the souls and got 21 of them. But unfortunately, this was not enough. I would need 5 for the Drax, 20 for the Mega Shark, 20 for the hollow chestplate, and another 20 for the Excalibur. However, I won't be making the Excalibur, as like mentioned before, all swords in this game were pretty useless. So in total, I would need 45 souls of might, meaning I would have to kill the destroyer another time. But for now, I focused on what I was able to obtain, which was the Mega Shark, which required illegal gun parts and shark fins. Both were easy to obtain. I did mention in the previous episode that the illegal gun parts would have only been used for the sand cannon, but this was incorrect. They were also used for the flamethrower and the Mega Shark. But these items aren't supposed to be accessible, so I was kind of right. Anyways, I eventually created the Mega Shark. However, it turns out this does the same amount of damage as the Phoenix Blaster. Although the Mega Shark is ultimately better as it shoots faster and has a 50% chance not to consume ammo, it's interesting that they made the Phoenix Blaster so strong. Some of you may also have noticed when using the destroyer spawner the item was not removed. I was hoping this would lead to a more interesting glitch, but as I selected the item it just despawned. At this point I wanted to see about the 2 other bosses. Originally I thought they were removed, or the game would crash if I tried spawning them. Like seen by the other enemies, they seem to spawn fine and function as intended despite there being no texture. However, the twins could be a bit more challenging, as unlike an enemy, this is an entire boss that is invisible. But anyways, that wasn't going to stop me. I farmed some souls of light and created the spawner. However, while doing that, I did come across some exclusive enemies, those being the spectral elemental and the spectral gastropod. Other than their color difference, they seem to function the same as their normal counterpart. But also, before spawning the twins, I wanted to kill the destroyer one more time. I was hoping that the hollow chestplate would be better than the adamantite chestplate. Unfortunately, after doing all that, it was not the case. Although it gave me a whopping 1 more defense, it gave me 7% increased critical strike chance, whereas the adamantite chestplate would give me 6% damage increase. And in my opinion, the damage increase is slightly more valuable. And because if I used the hollow chestplate I would lose the set bonus, I just sticked with the adamantite armor, which means at this point I was ready to kill the twins. This time I would use potions. The hunter potion could show me where these invisible enemies were, albeit with a small amount of particles, but it was better than nothing. But while preparing for this, I had another door glitch happen. This time it was the exact same glitch that I showed you in that video, with the chest and the block underneath it being destroyed. Unfortunately, I forgot to put something in the chest, so it entirely got destroyed, but nonetheless the glitch still happened. But remember when I said it was possible in modern Terraria to get invisible doors? Well, it turns out this glitch, or a very similar one, was found using transmutation. You may have heard of a Terraria concept called the black hole powered bore drill. This allows you to bore through the entire world. And I think this is what's happening in this glitch. Meaning this glitch that was discovered last year could have been discovered all the way back in 2014. I'll link this video in the description because I'm sure it explains basically what's going on here. But anyways, back to the twins. I spawned them and they were in fact invisible. The fight otherwise wasn't overly interesting. I was eventually able to kill them quite easily, and I was able to get 27 souls of sight, which would be enough for the Drax and the hollowed helmet. It wouldn't be enough to also get the hollowed repeater, but I prefer guns anyway, so I'm gonna stick with the Mega Shark. Much like the hollowed chestplate, the hollowed helmet wasn't much better than the adamantite helmet, which meant that my next goal was kill Skeletron Prime. So that's what I did. Eventually I created the spawner and then spawned Skeletron Prime. The arms ended up being visible, but the head was invisible, which meant there was only one one invisible enemy that I had to worry about. However, despite this, it was slightly harder than the twins, but nothing unmanageable. I eventually killed it and got enough souls for the Drax and the hollowed leggings, so I then created the hollowed armor. It only gave me a couple more defense, had the exact same set bonus, and switched out a 6% damage boost to a 7% critical strike chance boost, meaning it wasn't much better, but I kept it anyways. I then also created the Drax, finally getting the item that I spent so long trying to get in the first place. Other than that, there wasn't much else to do. I had hacked my way into hard mode, killed a couple invisible bosses, and then beat the game, meaning there was no other progression left to do, except I haven't killed the actual final boss. Because there was no final boss on the PC version, to release the game on mobile and console, they decided to add a custom boss, which if you didn't already know was Ocram, meaning if I actually wanted to beat the game I would have to kill this boss. But like the other bosses, this could be a bit challenging as there are no textures for Ocram or its servants. But first I wanted to look at all the mobile exclusive items, so that's what I did. I hacked into 23 exclusive items to see what they would do, and straight away I realized that some of the items had incorrect textures. It turns out these 5 textures, although included in the files, were not loaded in, so it then loaded whatever next textures there were, which in this case happens to be the light disc, mana star, the ninja, and a couple NPCs. But first I wanted to check out the armor as it's pretty iconic to this version. Although uncraftable in this version, this is how they would have been crafted. But anyways, I equipped the Titan armor as I was already using the ranged hollowed armor, and it turns out the player textures for these armor do not exist. So for obvious reasons I'm gonna have to be using the hollowed armor as vanity. The armors though didn't seem to do much. Obviously it increased my defense and damage output, but other than that there wasn't much to talk about. But I'm sure you're wondering what happens if I use the 5 pet items that have incorrect textures. Well, when using the petri dish, which is supposed to look like this and spawn a slime pet, it then spawned this random hammer texture. I was expecting it to crash or something, but this is way more interesting. The honeycomb with the texture of a mana star and the vial of blood with the texture of the ninja seem to spawn the actual player body textures. Pretty interesting looking pet if you ask me. The wolf fang and brain both had NPC textures. The wolf fang had NPC ID 0 and the brain had NPC ID 1. There's actually no NPC with ID 0, so the texture is a blank image. This explains why there is seemingly no image for the wolf fang. NPC ID 1 is the slime, which is why the brain has that texture. Anyways, the wolf fang spawns a texture for the mounting point for the spike ball, and the brain spawns a team icon. This is interesting because in this version there is no multiplayer. This is all interesting, but I'm sure you want to know what happens if I spawn the suspicious looking skull. For those who are unaware, this spawns Ocram. So armed with weapons and armor that I was supposed to get after killing Ocram, I decided to spawn it. Like mentioned before, all the related textures were not there, meaning this boss and its servants are completely invisible. Luckily the movement AI was almost taken directly from the Eye of Cthulhu, so for the most part I knew where it was gonna go. The fight ended up taking longer than I expected just because it had so much health, but eventually I did kill it, and like I expected it dropped adamantite and souls of blight. These souls of blight, like shown before, would have been used to craft the armor and weapons that I was using, but now there's really nothing left to do in the game, so comment down below what I should do next. And if this video gets 500 likes, I'll see if it's possible to beat the tutorial.